"Ranger, stop!" Lila Quinn's breath clouded in the frigid air as she yanked gently on the leash. The big German shepherd didn't budge. His body stiffened, ears pointed like radar, eyes locked on the dense pines just off the trail. There was something in the woods, something that didn't belong. The town of Snow Hollow was sinking into a pale, early dusk, its sky dimming under thick snow clouds. Everything else was hushed, the kind of winter silence that blankets even the smallest sounds. But this silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that pressed in, the kind that warned. Ranger growled low in his throat, the sound deep, almost reluctant, as if he hadn't wanted to scare her, but needed to. Then came the sound. Not loud, not even clear. A soft, broken whimper. Human. Lila's skin prickled under her coat. Ranger whined, then let out a long, unearthly howl that sent a ripple of fear through her chest. It wasn't his usual bark. It wasn't even a warning. It was a summons. She swallowed, gripping his leash tighter. "Okay, boy. Let's go see Ranger," moved like a bullet, no longer waiting. He darted off the trail and down a narrow embankment that cut through the pines. Lila followed, snow crunching beneath her boots, scarf flapping behind her. The leash tugged with urgency. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when the trees opened to a slope. And that's when she saw it. A patrol car lay crushed on its side at the bottom of the gully, half buried in snow and twisted saplings. Steam hissed from the broken hood. One of the tires spun slowly, like it hadn't gotten the message. And there, draped through the shattered driver's side window, was an arm. Bloody. Motionless. Lila stumbled to a stop, heart jackhammering in her chest. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. The wind swallowed her breath. Ranger didn't wait. He scrambled down the slope, his paws digging into the icy ground like he'd done this 100 times. Lila's legs shook, but she followed. "Please don't be dead." She whispered to no one, to everything. The car's front end had ploughed into a tree, the windshield spiderwebbed but intact. She could see the uniform before she saw the face. Navy blue, silver badge, a deputy. The man inside was slumped against the wheel, blood streaking down the side of his temple. His eyes were closed, his face pale, jaw slack. But he was breathing. Just barely. Ranger whined, pawing at the glass. His entire body vibrated with urgency. Lila's breath hitched. You knew. You knew someone was here. She looked around, but the road was far above, the trail hidden behind the trees. No one would see them from up there. No one would hear her scream. Her mittens trembled as she reached for her phone. No signal. She looked at Ranger. "Go get Mom! Go, boy, go!" Ranger hesitated for a split second. Then, without sound, he turned and bolted up the hill, disappearing into the trees with an energy she'd never seen before. She was alone now, with the wind, the snow, and a bleeding man in uniform. She crouched by the window, hands trembling as she brushed away shards of glass from the edge. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, voice cracking. "Help's coming." "My dog, he's fast. He'll bring help. The deputy didn't move." She looked at the name tag on his chest. Harrow. Deputy N. Harrow. Lila stayed low, tucked her coat around herself, and sat as close to the car as she dared. Her eyes never left his chest, watching the rise and fall that told her he was still alive. "Don't die," she said softly. "Please don't die." Ranger wouldn't let me walk away. Snow swirled around her, landing on her hat, her shoulders. Her cheeks burned from the cold. Minutes passed like hours, and then the trees above rustled. A shout broke through the silence. "Lila!" It was her mother's voice, Diane. Lila leapt to her feet. "Down here!" "We found someone." Footsteps pounded through the snow. Diane skidded down the slope, still in scrubs and snow boots, her coat flapping behind her. Behind her came Mason Trigg, their neighbor from 2 doors down, Ex-army, always quiet, always alert. "Oh my God!" Diane breathed, crouching beside the car. "That's Deputy Harrow." "You know him?" Lila asked. "Everyone in this town knows Nate Harrow." Mason was already at the other side, assessing the wreck. "We need to get him out." "Carefully. I'll call dispatch," Diane said, fumbling with her phone. "We'll need EMTs and—" "No." Mason cut in, voice flat. "Look at that brake line." He pointed under the crumpled hood, where something hung loose, frayed, slashed. That wasn't ice. Someone wanted this car off the road. Diane's face went pale. Lila didn't speak. She looked toward the hill, where Ranger stood at the edge of the trail, watching with dark, knowing eyes. She whispered, "You didn't just find him, did you?" "You found something else." Ranger didn't bark. He just stared. And the snow kept falling, like it was trying to bury something someone didn't want found. The snow had thickened, swirling in heavier gusts that danced through the pine trees like smoke. Lila's cheeks were raw, her fingers stiff despite the wool mittens pulled tightly to her wrists. But she didn't move from the wreck, not while the man inside was still breathing. Deputy Harrow hadn't stirred, not a twitch, not a sound. His lips were slightly parted, face ashen and slack. Every few seconds, Lila pressed her gloved hand against the cold metal door frame, straining to feel a vibration. Any movement, any sign of life. She had seen dead before. Her father, 2 years ago. He had been pale like that too. Lila clenched her jaw and blinked hard, refusing to let the fear take over. "You're not gonna die," she muttered. "Ranger's bringing help." He always does. The wind howled down the ravine. But Lila stayed. Far above, on the ridge that led back toward town, Ranger ran. He was a dark blur against the snow, moving with purpose that bordered on military precision. His breaths came in tight puffs, his paws slicing through snowbanks, claws gripping the frozen road. His entire body was a machine tuned to one task: get help. He knew the path, knew every corner of this forest, and more than that, he knew who to go to. 2 years ago, Ranger had been a K-9 officer, partnered with an officer in Denver who never came home from a traffic stop gone wrong. After the shooting, no one wanted a dog with that kind of history. Ranger had been left in the concrete silence of a shelter kennel, his muzzle graying, his eyes too intense. Until Diane Quinn walked in. The widow of a firefighter who died in a winter blaze, Diane had seen grief that didn't need words. She'd looked into Ranger's eyes and recognized something there. Loss, loyalty, purpose, with nowhere to go. She brought him home to Lila. At first the bond was tentative, a girl swallowed by grief, a dog haunted by duty. But they found each other day by day. Ranger became Lila's guardian, her confidant. He would lie at the foot of her bed, breathing in sync with her tears. He walked beside her to school, waited outside in snow or rain, and sat under her desk when she read. She whispered secrets to him that she couldn't say to anyone else. And now he was doing what he was made for. He sprinted into the neighborhood, past shuttered storefronts and parked pickups dusted in snow. Lights were flicking on in the houses, early evening settling in. Ranger cut through yards, slid across a frozen driveway, and stopped at the back steps of a modest ranch-style house tucked behind a maple tree. He barked once, then again, louder, faster. Inside, Diane Quinn was pouring tea, her scrubs still damp from the shift at the clinic. The sound froze her. She turned to the window. "Ranger?" She opened the door, and the big dog lunged inside, barking, then darted back out, tail rigid, eyes electric with purpose. He turned once, barked again, and started running. Diane didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, left the mug steaming on the counter, and followed. Her boots slid on the ice, her breath catching. The last time she'd seen Ranger like this was when Lila had fallen through thin lake ice trying to rescue a stray cat. He had pulled her out. She trusted the dog more than most humans. As Diane rounded the corner, Mason Trigg appeared at the edge of his driveway, keys in hand. "You see the dog tear through here like a missile?" he asked. "He's leading me somewhere," Diane said, already climbing into her SUV. Mason squinted, then nodded once. "Give me 10 seconds, I'm coming too." Back in the gully, Lila's lips had gone numb. She rubbed her hands together, shifting from foot to stay warm. She had never been more scared. But she wasn't going to leave him. Not like this. "You're Deputy Harrow," she whispered. "You gave a talk at our school last month. You brought stickers and talked about seat belts. You said doing the right thing is sometimes lonely." "I remember that," she swallowed. The man didn't move. She leaned closer to the window, fogging the edge of the glass. "I'm alone a lot too." The patrol car creaked softly in the cold, the frame shifting with each gust of wind. Above them, headlights flickered through the trees. The low rumble of tires crunched over snow. Lila let out a sob of relief. "Mom!" Diane skidded down the hill first, Ranger just ahead, barking once, then falling silent. Mason followed close behind, duffel bag in hand. Diane dropped to her knees beside the vehicle. "Are you hurt?" "No, but he is. He hasn't moved." Mason was already circling the car, assessing damage. "We need to stabilize the neck, get a blanket under him before we even think about lifting." Lila stepped back. Diane knelt beside the window, checking the deputy's vitals with trained hands. "He's still with us," she said, voice taut. "Pulse is weak. Breathing shallow. Concussion for sure. He's lucky you found him." "She didn't find him," Mason said, voice low. "The dog did." Ranger stood a few feet away, chest rising and falling in the cold. His eyes stayed fixed on the man in the car. Watching. Guarding. They worked fast. Mason stabilized Nate's spine using his field kit. Diane eased a wool blanket around his neck. They moved as a team, military, clinical, silent. Then, with great care, Mason and Diane pulled Nate from the wreckage, inch by inch. Lila held Ranger's collar, whispering, "You did it." "You saved him." Ranger didn't move. He watched the man's face the whole time. They got Nate onto a stretcher Diane kept in the trunk for emergencies and slid it into the back of her SUV. Diane climbed in beside him, monitoring his airway. Mason turned to Lila. "You ride with me," he said gently. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat before anyone could stop him. "No," Lila said. "He rides in the back." With me, the storm was rising again, snow curling around the houses as if the forest wanted to reclaim its secrets. But this one had already been found, and as the SUV sped off toward town, Ranger pressed his head gently against Nate Harrow's arm and didn't lift it for the rest of the ride. The road back to the crash site was slick, the wind biting sharper now, and the snowfall thickening by the minute. Diane's SUV had just disappeared down the curve toward the hospital with Deputy Harrow barely clinging to consciousness. Mason had stayed behind with Lila and Ranger, double-checking the area before the snow buried any more of the scene. "We need to document this before it's all gone," he said, voice low and deliberate. "You don't get a second chance at this kind of thing." He was crouched by the twisted guardrail, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other. Lila stood nearby, arms crossed over her chest, watching the gully below with a haunted stillness. Ranger, however, wasn't still. The dog had been pacing since the moment Diane's tail lights vanished. His nose worked the air. His ears swiveled back and forth. And then? He stopped. Without a sound, Ranger turned and walked to the edge of the woods just north of the crash. He paused, sniffed again, then veered off into the snow-covered underbrush. "Ranger?" Lila called softly, but he didn't look back. Mason turned. Let him go. He's onto something. Ranger moved with purpose, threading through the trees with the precision of a tracker, not a pet. The way his shoulders shifted, how he avoided branches without hesitation. It was muscle memory. Not just instinct, but training. Lila and Mason followed his trail, carefully, their boots crunching through the thin layer of crusted snow. About 30 yards from the guardrail, near a turnout long used by snowplow trucks, Ranger stopped. He barked once. Not loud, just enough to say, "Here." Lila reached him first. "What is it, boy?" she asked, crouching beside him. There, half buried beneath a dusting of snow, was a metal toolbox. Dented. Old, but not frozen over. Not forgotten. The lid sat slightly ajar, as if someone had dropped it in haste. Mason came up behind them, instantly alert. He dropped to one knee, pulled on his gloves, and pried the box fully open. Inside, arranged haphazardly, were tools. Wrenches, wire cutters, a bleeder kit used for brake lines, a cloth rag soaked with dark fluid. The bitter scent of brake dust and motor oil hit hard. Mason didn't speak right away. He reached into the box carefully, lifting one of the tools with 2 fingers. Grease smeared the handle. On the rag, a faint rusty brown stain told a story of either old blood or fluid, darker than oil. Lila's voice was barely a whisper. "Is that from the car?" "No," Mason said, scanning the tree line. "It's from whoever made sure it crashed." Ranger stood like a statue beside them, head high, body tense but calm. Mason took a slow breath. They cut the brake line. Then they stashed the tools here. Figured no one would come back before the snow buried it all. Lila's throat tightened. "Someone tried to kill him." Mason nodded once. And they didn't count on a retired K9 sniffing out the truth. Ranger moved slightly closer to the toolbox, then sat beside it, shoulders squared, tail motionless, like he was guarding evidence, like he understood. Mason took out his phone, snapped photos quickly, then zipped the toolbox into a canvas bag he kept in his backpack. He didn't explain why he had a pack like that. He didn't need to. "Let's go," he said. "No one touches this except Diane and the state troopers." Lila's eyes didn't leave the spot. "Are we going to tell the sheriff?" Mason paused. His eyes scanned the woods again before answering. "No, not yet." There was a weight in those words that settled hard in her chest. Back at the road, Mason tucked the bag carefully under the back seat of his pickup and double-checked the locks. Ranger jumped into the front seat without being told. Lila climbed in next to him. "Do you think they'll come back?" Mason started the truck, watching the mirrors. "If they know he survived." "Yeah, they might." Ranger gave a low, gravelly sound from his chest. Lila rested her hand on his back. "You'll protect us, won't you?" The dog didn't react. Didn't need to. The truck pulled onto the road, its headlights cutting through the thickening white. Behind them, the snow had already begun to erase the footprints. The tools might have been lost forever, just one more buried secret in a town used to keeping them quiet. But not this time. Not with Ranger watching. As they drove, Mason made a quiet call to Diane. Short, measured. Then another, this time to someone in the next county. A name Lila didn't recognize, but the tone said everything. Trust had limits here. By the time they reached the edge of Snow Hollow, the wind had picked up. Ranger stayed upright the whole ride, alert, scanning out the window. Mason parked 2 blocks from the hospital. "Just to be safe," he said. "We don't know who's watching." They walked the rest of the way, Lila holding Ranger's leash, her other hand in Mason's. The snow fell harder now, silent and suffocating. But inside that silence was a pulse. The kind you only heard if you were really listening. A breath still breathing. a secret waiting to be spoken, and a dog who wouldn't let it stay buried. The hospital waiting room smelled like bleach and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving everything a washed-out pallor, like the color had drained from the world. Diane sat stiffly in a plastic chair, still in her damp scrubs, a styrofoam cup untouched in her hand. Lila sat beside her, silent, legs swinging just above the linoleum floor. Ranger lay at Lila's feet, alert despite his stillness. His ears twitched with every approaching footstep. His eyes stayed fixed on the hallway where Deputy Harrow had been taken. "They're keeping him overnight," Diane said quietly. "He's stable, but his pressure dropped. Head trauma, cracked ribs, mild internal bleeding. They won't know more until the CT comes back." Lila nodded, hugging her knees. "Your dog saved his life, sweetheart." Ranger shifted only slightly, one paw crossing over the other. The elevator dinged, and both Diane and Lila turned. The man who stepped out didn't look like part of the hospital staff. Tall, barrel-chested, hair slicked back with too much product, and a badge clipped crookedly to his belt. Sheriff Ron Keller. Acting sheriff, technically. The previous one had retired just months earlier, and Keller had taken over like he'd been born for the role. He smiled too, quickly, laughed too loudly, and had a tendency to dismiss anything that didn't fit neatly into the world as he saw it. "Diane," he greeted, his voice full of forced warmth. "Heard you were the first responder out there." "Unofficially," she replied, standing. He wouldn't have made it if Lila and Ranger hadn't found him. Keller glanced down at the dog. "Well, I'll be." "That the mutt from your street?" Lila flinched at the word. Diane's expression cooled. "His name is Ranger." "He's a retired K-9. Sure he is," Keller said, already turning his attention back to Diane. "So listen, I just spoke with the ER team. Sounds like Deputy Harrow had himself a little slide off the road. Nasty spot. That bend's taken more than a few bumpers in winter." Diane narrowed her eyes. "He didn't slide." The brakes were tampered with. Keller raised an eyebrow and gave a half smirk. "Tampered with?" Mason stepped out from a side hallway, holding the canvas bag carefully. "She's not guessing." We found tools, grease-stained, a bleeder kit. Stashed about 30 yards north of the crash, Keller's smile flattened. Mason continued. "Ranger led us to it. No one's touched it but me." Keller gave a light chuckle, like they'd told a joke. "You saying someone sabotaged a sheriff deputy's patrol vehicle?" "That's a hell of an accusation," Diane stepped forward. "We're not accusing. We're giving you evidence." Keller looked at the bag like it might bite. "And you're basing this on a dog. He's trained. And I'm trained," Mason said evenly. "I spent 15 years running recon logistics. I know a setup when I see one." Keller held up a hand, patronizing. "Let's just slow down. I appreciate your concern, really, but the deputy's probably disoriented. Head trauma can create some wild memory gaps. Hell, maybe he forgot to check the tires. You think Nate Harrow doesn't maintain his vehicle?" Diane snapped. "He's meticulous." "And he was working a case, which is precisely why people want this buried," Mason added. Keller's jaw tensed. "There's no people, Mason. This is Snow Hollow. Not New York City." Lila had been quiet the whole time, but now she spoke. "Are you even going to test the tools?" Keller looked down at her. She stood small but steady, her chin lifted just slightly. He softened his voice. "Listen, kiddo, I know this seems scary. But grown-up stuff's not always as dramatic as it feels. Sometimes accidents are just accidents." Ranger stood up. It was subtle. No growl, no bark, just a silent rise to full height. His body stood between Lila and the sheriff, muscles coiled, ears locked forward, eyes sharp. Keller stepped back half an inch before catching himself. Control your dog." "He's controlled," Mason said. "He just doesn't like lies." Keller's face twitched. He turned back to Diane. "You do what you want with that toolbox, but I'll be filing this under incident due to poor road conditions unless I get something from the vehicle inspection team that says otherwise. You're ignoring a pattern," Diane said, her voice tight with disbelief. "I'm maintaining order," he snapped, and with that he pivoted and strode back to the elevator. The doors slid shut. Silence fell. Lila sat slowly. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. Mason exhaled hard. "He's scared." "No," Diane murmured. "He's involved." Lila finally whispered, "If the people who are supposed to help won't listen, then who do we go to?" Ranger sat beside her, resting his head on her knee, anchoring her like always. It wasn't just disbelief that passed over her face now. It was something heavier, the beginning of doubt in the very system she had trusted. And for a girl who still wore her school ID under her jacket, that was a loss too big to name. The snow had stopped falling overnight, leaving a thin layer of frost that glittered under the pale morning sun. The world looked clean, still, almost innocent. But Lila Quinn had stopped trusting how things looked. Ranger walked beside her, leash slack between them, his head low and nose working the air in steady sweeps. He wasn't sniffing out squirrels or frozen scraps from the trash bins like any other dog. He was working. Focused. Calculating. His ears flicked at every sound. His pace only slowed when he picked up something new. They passed the edge of town, cutting behind the snowed-over softball field. Lila knew what she was doing would probably get her grounded for a week if her mom found out. But after what she'd seen at the hospital, how Sheriff Keller had dismissed them like they were children playing detective, she didn't care. They had evidence. They had motive. They just didn't have anyone who wanted to listen. But maybe they didn't need anyone. Not yet. Lila tugged her hood tighter around her head and checked the time. School had already started. She'd texted her mum saying she was staying home sick, which wasn't exactly a lie. There was a sickness in her gut, but it had nothing to do with a fever. Their first stop was Deputy Harrow's cruiser. What was left of it? The city tow yard was locked up, but the fence wasn't tall, and Ranger didn't seem to care about posted hours. With a little boost, Lila was over the fence, landing with a grunt in the snow. Ranger stayed behind it, standing sentry. The patrol car was tucked at the back, still mangled, covered in salt dust and streaked with rust-colored smears. She climbed up to the window and looked inside. No blood now. It had been cleaned out. Wiped down like nothing had happened. But someone had missed something. A small black dash cam still clung to the windshield, a suction mount holding tight to the cracked glass. The camera was off, its indicator light dark. But Lila reached up, twisted the mount, and pulled it loose. She dropped back to the ground and held the camera in her hands. Cold, heavy. Her heart thudded. Most dash cams looped over old footage every few days unless you pulled the card. She opened the bottom flap. The card was still inside. She slid it into her coat pocket. "We've got something," she whispered to Ranger. The dog gave a quiet huff, his breath fogging in the cold. They were out of the yard 10 minutes later, walking toward the road near the State Patrol substation. Ranger kept veering off to the right, sniffing the shoulder, tail stiff and low. "What do you smell, boy?" Lila asked. He didn't answer, of course, but his entire body said, "This way." The road curved around a low embankment, shielded from the highway by a thicket of black spruce. This was where Harrow's car had left the road. Lila recognized it from the snow-cleared scar leading down the slope. But Ranger didn't head towards the crash site. He pulled left, nose to the ground, and began zigzagging along the shoulder. Lila followed. About 30 yards down, he stopped. His paw scraped at the edge of the asphalt, just where the snow had begun to melt. A dark stain bloomed through the slush, brownish black, with a sheen that shimmered in the light. Brake fluid. Ranger sniffed the patch, then looked back at her. Not just a stain, a trail. She followed his gaze. The mark led back up the road, away from the crash, not toward it. Toward the spot where Harrow would have started braking, where someone could have bled the line. Lila's breath caught. "Somebody did it right here," she murmured. "Right out in the open." Ranger sat beside the stain, his eyes scanning the woods, watching. They walked a few minutes more before circling back, cutting behind the substation, staying out of view. Lila kept her hood up. She didn't know who might be watching, but she felt it, the way people feel storms before they break. They stopped at Mason's house. He wasn't home, but his shed was unlocked. She slid inside with Ranger at her heels, pulled out the laptop Mason had left on the workbench, and inserted the SD card. The screen flickered to life. A moment later, she was watching the last hour of Deputy Harrow's shift. Snow, a routine patrol, nothing much for the first few minutes. Then headlights flashed behind him. Harrow pulled over, another cruiser, no dash lights, no siren, just rolled up behind him and sat there. The footage was grainy, but the timestamp was clear. This was 22 minutes before the crash. Harrow got out. He walked back to the other cruiser. Then, no audio, but Lila could see his hands go up slightly, palms out. Not defensive, just confused. Calm. Talking. Someone stepped out of the other vehicle. The camera angle didn't catch their face, but she saw the badge glint. And the shoulders. Wide. Confident. She knew that frame. Sheriff Keller. The screen skipped. The video stuttered. Then Harrow was back in his cruiser. He looked shaken. He sat still for almost 30 seconds. Then he buckled his belt and drove off. The footage ended. No crash, just that look on his face. The kind that said something had gone very, very wrong. Ranger was staring at the screen with her, silent. Lila sat back. Her chest ached. "I think he knew," she whispered. "I think he knew what was about to happen." She opened the folder on Mason's desktop labeled HARROWNOTES. It was the file Mason had pulled from Nate's office when Diane told him to trust his gut. The notes weren't just on patrol routes. They were detailed logs, times, license plates, names, most of them scribbled with double underlines and circles. There were mentions of short-run deliveries, unmarked vans, discrepancies in warehouse logs. And one name showed up more than any other: Morton Freight and Storage. Kyle Morton, the town's biggest donor, owner of half the trucking contracts in Snow Hollow, and best friend of acting sheriff Ron Keller. Lila felt the cold in her spine before she even noticed the window had cracked open behind her. She looked down at Ranger. He was already facing the door, ears perked, tail dead still. He knew what was coming. So did she. They weren't just chasing a hunch anymore. They had stepped straight into something real, something dangerous. And the only thing standing between them and whoever wanted this buried was a 12-year-old girl and a dog who never stopped watching. The soft beep of a heart monitor echoed through the hospital room, steady and slow. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but the blinds were drawn, casting the room in a muted grey that matched the mood perfectly. Deputy Nate Harrow stirred beneath the covers. A thin layer of sweat glistened on his forehead, the bruise across his temple darkening at the edges. The sling cradling his arm kept his right shoulder locked in place, and his ribs, taped tightly beneath the gown, forced shallow, calculated breaths. He blinked against the dim light, disoriented, until his eyes found a familiar shape at the foot of his bed. Ranger. The German shepherd sat tall and still, gaze locked on him, ears forward. He didn't move, didn't bark, just watched. Then, as if on cue, the door creaked open. Diane Quinn stepped in quietly, followed by Mason Trigg and Lila. Mason nodded once toward Nate, while Lila moved straight to Ranger and slid a hand across his thick coat. "You're awake," Diane said, her voice low but steady. Nate's lips cracked with effort. "Feels like I got hit by a train." "You got lucky," Mason said, stepping beside the bed. "That train didn't finish the job." Nate's eyes flicked between them. "Ranger, he found me. He wouldn't let Lila leave," Diane said. "He knew." From the start, a ghost of a smile touched Nate's face. "Smart dog." Ranger blinked once but didn't shift. Diane leaned in slightly. "You need to tell us what happened." Nate's smile faded. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he inhaled, wincing at the tightness in his side. "I was working something, off the books. Didn't trust the department enough to file it proper." Mason's jaw tightened. "Because of Keller." Nate nodded, slow and painful. "He's not just turning a blind eye. He's in it." "Deep in what?" Diane asked. "Smuggling," Nate said flatly. "Not drugs, not weapons, cargo, unregistered shipments coming in through back roads and being filtered through Morton Freight. Kyle Morton," Lila said softly. Nate looked at her, surprised. "You know about him?" "She found your notes," Diane said, "and your dash cam." For the first time, Nate's eyes filled with something more than pain. Respect. "Smart kid." Ranger let out a short huff, as if in agreement. Nate continued, his voice rough. "Morton's trucks weren't just dropping off pallets. There were people, workers brought in off books, housed in rentals around town, some of them minors. I caught wind of it 3 months ago, started digging." Mason exhaled sharply. "I tried to stay quiet," Nate said. "Didn't share it with anyone except one state contact. Thought I could get more evidence first." He shifted, face tightening with the movement. "I was close. Too close. Keller called me to meet on the Ridgeway stretch, said it was about an old warrant. But the second I got there, I knew something was off." "You were followed," Diane said. "I was set up," Nate corrected. "We talked for a minute." Then he stepped back, said something about letting the snow do the work. That's when the brakes gave out. He paused, breath ragged. I tried to control it. But with those curves, there was no way silence filled the room. Lila knelt by Ranger, her fingers twisting into the thick fur at his neck. We found the brake fluid trail. And the tools. He stashed them near the turnout. "He?" Nate asked. "Keller, or someone working for him," Mason said. "Either way, it wasn't random." I didn't want to believe it at first, Diane admitted. But the way he showed up at the hospital, the way he tried to shut it all down. Nate's voice was almost a whisper. "He's got people watching the department. Probably even has access to the report logs, which means we can't trust anyone inside the station," Mason said. "Not without risking your life again." Nate looked up, expression sharpening despite the haze of medication. "Then we go outside. We take this to the state. Directly. We will," Diane said. "But we do it right." No mistakes. Nate's gaze dropped to Ranger. "That dog. He saved my life. He didn't just find you," Lila said. "He knew something was wrong before we did." Nate nodded slowly. "He's the only one I'd trust right now to sniff out what's real." Ranger stepped, closer, resting his chin gently on the edge of the mattress. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't grand, but it carried the weight of quiet loyalty. Nate closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling. "I kept a flash drive," he said, voice fading slightly. "It's got everything. Contacts, license plates, surveillance notes. I hid it behind the breaker panel in my garage. We'll get it," Mason said without hesitation. "Be careful," Nate said. "If Keller gets wind of it, you won't just be dealing with small-town politics. These people have money, muscle, and no hesitation." Ranger lifted his head and stared toward the hallway. Something had changed in the air. Diane moved to check the blinds. Mason quietly stepped to the door, listening, but no one came. Still, Ranger didn't relax. Diane turned back. "We need to move fast." Nate looked at her, eyes clearer now. "I didn't expect to wake up." "I really didn't. You're not done," she said. He nodded, then looked at Lila. "Thank you." For not walking away, Lila gave a small, solemn smile. "Ranger wouldn't let me." And across the hospital hallway, the security camera above the nurse's station blinked once, then twice, then went dark. The night settled over Snow Hollow like a loaded breath held too long. The storm had passed, but the quiet that followed was heavier than any snowfall. It crept into the cracks of Diane Quinn's modest house, blanketing the windows in frost and turning every creak of the old floorboards into a warning. Inside, the lights were off. Lila lay curled under her blanket, Ranger at her side. Her mum had said it was better to keep the house dark tonight. Safer, less visible. The living room blinds had been drawn, and every lock double-checked. Mason was staying close by, and Deputy Harrow, still stiff and moving slower than he liked, had refused to go back to the hospital after discharge. He was upstairs, sleeping in the guest room with a pillow propped behind his ribs and a Glock under his blanket. Lila's breath had just begun to slow into a half-sleep rhythm when Ranger lifted his head. No growl, no bark, just alert. He rose soundlessly from the rug, ears rotating forward, body stiff as a statue. Lila sat up. "What is it?" she whispered. Ranger turned toward the bedroom door, his nose flaring. That's when she heard it too. A floorboard creaked. But it wasn't from above, where Nate was. It came from the back of the house, the kitchen. Ranger moved to the door, sniffing at the gap beneath it. Then he let out a low, guttural sound. A warning, not of fear, but of certainty. Lila stood, her heart pounding. She reached for the baseball bat tucked beside her dresser, just like Mason had shown her. The door suddenly rattled, then slammed shut from the outside. She lunged for it, but the bolt slid home, locked from the other side. "Mom!" she shouted. No answer. Ranger barked, loud and sharp, the sound of shuffling, then glass breaking. Something heavy tipped over downstairs. Lila backed up, dragging her blanket to the far side of the room. Her voice shook. "Ranger, what do we do?" The dog was already moving. He circled the room once, then reared back, body low. Without hesitation, he charged the door. It didn't give the first time, or the second. But on the third, with a growl that vibrated through the floorboards, Ranger cracked the doorframe. The lock snapped. They were out. Lila stayed behind him as they crept down the stairs. The hallway was lit only by moonlight spilling through the kitchen window, except the window was shattered. Cold wind swept into the room. Two men moved through the house like shadows. One was tall, wiry, wearing a dark jacket and black gloves. The other, heavier, carried a crowbar loosely in one hand. Their faces were masked. They didn't expect Ranger. The first man turned too late. Ranger launched from the shadows, jaws clamping down on the heavy man's forearm. The crowbar fell with a dull clang, and the man screamed, collapsing beneath the weight of 90 pounds of fury and purpose. The second man bolted toward the hallway, reaching for something in his coat. Lila ducked just in time as he swept past her. A door upstairs slammed open. Nate. He moved fast, despite the pain, gun raised, finger tight on the trigger. "Freeze!" The second man stumbled, skidded to a stop, arms halfway up. Mason came through the front door, rifle in hand. He must have seen the broken window from outside. The hallway filled with shouted commands, barking, and the metallic rattle of cuffs. The man pinned beneath Ranger howled again, trying to roll away, but Ranger adjusted, never releasing, never faltering. His body weight kept the intruder down without drawing blood. He didn't attack to punish. He held to stop. A trained dog, operating without orders, acting on instinct and allegiance alone. "Ranger off," Mason said sharply, stepping forward. Only then did the dog release, stepping back but not leaving the man. His body remained tense, tail stiff, chest heaving. Diane appeared in the hallway, breathless, holding a first aid kit and her phone. She looked at the broken glass, the crowbar, the men on the ground, and at Ranger. Lila ran into her arms, shaking. "They locked us in," she gasped. "He broke the door." He knew one of the men cursed under his breath. Nate knelt beside him, wincing. "Who sent you?" No answer. Mason stepped forward, ripped off the ski mask. The man was young, maybe early 30s, a faded tattoo running from his neck to his collarbone. Mason frowned. "Not local." The other man, still standing, smirked. "You think this is about one cop? Keller's not the top. You stirred something bigger. You tried to kill a kid." Diane snapped. "She wasn't the target." The dog was. The room went silent. Ranger let out a low, rumbling growl. Nate's voice was sharp. "You know what that tells me? It means someone in Keller's circle knew this dog was more than a mutt, and that someone scared enough to send you two out in the middle of the night." Lila pulled back from her mom. "They wanted to stop him from finding more." Mason stepped forward. They failed. The rest of the night was a blur of police reports, state troopers from 2 counties over, and quiet nods of recognition from agents who didn't wear local badges. The intruders were hauled off in unmarked vehicles before sunrise. No one said who had called in the favors, but someone had seen enough. By the time morning light hit the frost-covered porch, Ranger lay curled at the foot of Lila's bed, eyes closed but ears still alert. He didn't sleep long. He didn't need to, because his work wasn't done yet, and in the hearts of those he protected, the line between animal and guardian had long since faded. The cold morning sun hung low over Snow Hollow as Ranger padded silently across the cracked concrete of the sheriff's department parking lot. His paws moved with cautious precision, nose sweeping in slow, measured arcs. Mason Trigg walked a few steps behind, his boots crunching on salt-stained ice. Diane and Deputy Nate Harrow flanked them, both with eyes scanning the surrounding lot. Lila waited in the truck, watching from a distance. Too risky for her to be close. It wasn't official business. It couldn't be. Sheriff Keller was still in charge, still acting like nothing had happened, even after 2 men broke into Diane's house in the middle of the night. The local department was compromised. But there was one place Nate had always suspected hid more than just maintenance supplies: the old detached garage behind the sheriff's station. "I used to see Morton's guys pull around here late," Nate said quietly, adjusting the brace on his ribs. "Always after hours. No markings on the trucks, no paperwork filed. Why didn't you confront Keller sooner?" Diane asked. Nate hesitated. "Because I thought I could take him down with facts." "I was wrong." Ranger paused, head turning sharply toward the back corner of the building. He sniffed again, then moved forward with intent. "He's on something," Mason said. "Let him lead." The garage hadn't been used for patrol vehicles in years. Its lock was rusted, but not broken. Mason picked it in less than a minute using a tension wrench and an old Marine-issued pick he kept in his coat. The door groaned open. Inside, the air was sharp with oil, damp cardboard, and the faint trace of something far worse: copper and rot. A single light bulb flickered from a chain overhead, casting weak shadows over a maze of shelving units and crates stacked too neatly for disuse. Ranger stepped in first. His body shifted from relaxed to alert, tail low, nose twitching. He stopped near the far wall, sniffed once, then twice, then growled, low and sure. Mason followed quickly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger turned, pressed his snout against the corner of a metal shelving unit, then pawed gently at the floor. A streak ran along the baseboard, faded but distinct. Blood. Dried. Old enough not to stink, but not so old that it had vanished. "Someone bled here," Mason said. Nate crouched with effort and ran his flashlight over the floor. "Look at this," he murmured. There was a small scuff mark beneath the shelf's frame, a scrape in the concrete where something had been moved repeatedly. "A false panel," Nate said. "Help me lift." Mason helped him slide the shelf a few inches to the right. Beneath it, hidden beneath a warped panel of wood stained to match the floor, was a small trap door. They exchanged a glance. Then Diane stepped forward and yanked it open. Inside was a narrow space, maybe 3 feet deep, lit only by the faint spill from above. But the contents were unmistakable. Boxes, dozens of them, labeled with codes instead of names. And tucked between the crates, nestled in the corner like a forgotten relic, was a tiny black lens, no larger than a pencil eraser. Ranger stood still, tail stiff, watching. Diane reached in, pulled the camera loose. "Still warm," she said. "It's on a motion sensor." Mason blew out a breath. "Somebody's watching this place. Or was." Nate said, "Until we tripped it." Diane took out her phone and snapped photos of everything. The boxes, the blood stain, the hidden lens. She moved with clinical calm, methodical. "We need to get this to someone who won't bury it," she said. Nate nodded. "I know a contact at the State Bureau. His name's Rivas. He's clean. He's been after Keller's friend Morton for years, but could never make anything stick." "Then we give it to Rivas," Mason said. But Diane was already uploading. She tapped into a secure Dropbox account, one set up years ago after her husband's death when she'd worked briefly with fire investigators in Denver. She'd kept it quietly, just in case. Now she added every image, every file from Nate's flash drive, and every piece of data they had, including the recovered footage from the dash cam. She typed one line in the message to Rivas. "Keller's hiding something bigger than you think. We have a witness. And a dog who doesn't miss." Then she hit send. Outside, a car drove by slowly. Ranger's ears perked. His body stiffened. The group dropped into silence. "Time to go," Mason said. They backed out, locked the garage again, and left no sign they had ever been there. Ranger stayed close to Lila as they drove off, his body pressed lightly against her leg in the back seat, his breathing steady, watchful, waiting. Later that night, Diane received a message back from Agent Rivas. Received. Confirming contents. Stay put. Trust no one locally. We're coming. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Ranger slept by the door that night, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed open long into the dark. He wasn't guarding the house. He was guarding a truth that finally had a chance to break through. The town hall meeting was supposed to be routine. Updates on winter road clearance, budget allocations for the fire department, the annual chili cook-off. But not today. Today, Snow Hollow would remember. Diane stood quietly in the back of the hall, her coat still damp from the morning's sleet. Beside her, Mason leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Nate Harrow, bruised but upright, sat just 2 rows from the front. And between them all, lying calm and steady on the cool tile floor, was Ranger. Alert but still, like he already knew how the morning would end. Sheriff Keller hadn't noticed anything unusual when he entered. Dressed in his usual pressed uniform, silver badge glinting under the fluorescence, He shook hands, forced a few smiles, and began his report like every other month. That's when the doors opened. 2 men in dark suits walked in first, clean-cut, stern-faced. Behind them followed 4 state officers in tactical grey. Agent Rivas, from the Bureau of Criminal Investigations, stepped forward and calmly raised his ID. "This meeting is now under state jurisdiction," he said without raising his voice. "Sheriff William Keller, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and participation in a multi-state smuggling ring." The silence was seismic. For 1 long second, no one moved. Keller blinked. Then he laughed, short and incredulous. "You're out of your mind," he scoffed. "This is a setup?" But Diane stepped forward then, holding a brown envelope. Inside were stills from the garage, a frame from the recovered camera footage, his face in half-shadow, captured mid-handshake with Morton, and a printout of the encrypted email, verified and traced back to his official department account. Agent Rivas didn't waver. "You can deny it all you want, Sheriff," he said, "but your digital fingerprints are everywhere. So are your lies." Keller's eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on Diane, then Nate, then Ranger. "You think this whole thing was cracked by a mutt?" He spat. "No," Diane said evenly, "but he's the only one who never lied." The cuffs clicked shut around Keller's wrists. People began murmuring. Shock, confusion, betrayal. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their own roles uncertain now under scrutiny. Outside the windows, cameras began flashing. News vans had arrived faster than anyone expected. As Keller was led out of the hall, a woman near the front row stood up. "My brother was arrested 2 years ago on Keller's orders," she said, voice shaking. "He never had a trial." Another voice joined in. "My cousin disappeared after filing a complaint about a traffic stop." Nobody followed up. Then another. And another. Truth was bleeding out now, rapid and irreversible. Later that afternoon, formal notice was issued from the state attorney's office. The entire Snow Hollow Police Department would be under immediate review. Several deputies were placed on administrative leave. Nate Harrow was reinstated temporarily as interim liaison, and Diane was formally thanked for her cooperation and bravery in aiding a state-level investigation. But none of that made the evening news. Instead, the footage that looped across local and national channels was the same quiet clip captured by a freelance journalist's phone. Ranger standing beside Diane as Keller was walked out. Calm, steady, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked on the man who had once dismissed him as broken. The caption read, "K9 once abandoned brings down corrupt sheriff." People across the country shared the video. Veterans commented with pride. Dog trainers reposted it with notes about loyalty and instinct. But Ranger didn't know about the headlines. He didn't care for applause. That night, back home, Lila curled up with him on the living room rug, gently stroking the fur between his ears. "You're famous now," she whispered. Ranger yawned and rested his head on her knee. Fame meant nothing. What mattered was that the bad man was gone. His girl was safe. The family was whole again. Later, Diane sat on the porch with Mason. She looked out across the yard, where Ranger lay stretched under the porch light's glow. "He didn't do it for medals," she said. "No," Mason agreed. "He did it because he knew the difference between right and wrong. And he never forgot who left him behind." Diane was quiet for a moment. "He never asked for orders either," she added. "Some heroes don't need them." Inside, the house was still. But outside, under the faint breeze of coming snow, a dog's ears twitched, not in fear, not in alarm, only in peace. Because tonight, for the first time in a long while, Snow Hollow belonged to the truth. The gymnasium at Snow Hollow Elementary had never held a crowd this large, not even for the Christmas recital. Folding chairs lined the basketball court, parents filled the bleachers, and kids stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering and pointing toward the makeshift stage draped in blue and gold. A banner hung above it all, fluttering gently from the air vents. Community Hero Day, honoring bravery in silence. Ranger sat at the edge of the stage, wearing nothing but his faded working vest. There were newer ones, cleaner ones, but Diane had insisted he wear this one. The tear down the side had been patched by Lila herself. It mattered more than medals ever could. Diane stood to the left of the podium, her hair pinned neatly, though a few strands had escaped with the morning breeze. Nate stood beside her, in uniform again, but not the old one. This time, he wore the insignia of the State K-9 Division, a new role, a new mission. He would be overseeing the rehabilitation and placement of retired working dogs. A job he hadn't applied for, a job that found him. The mayor tapped the microphone and smiled, nervously clearing his throat. "There are moments," he began, "when a town finds itself held together not by power or policy, but by a single act of loyalty. Today we honor one of those moments, and the soul who delivered it." He turned toward Ranger. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. "Ranger," the mayor continued, "for bravery, instinct, and service beyond command, the town of Snow Hollow and the state of Wyoming present you with the Medal of Honor for Civilian K-9. Service. A gentle cheer rose from the audience. Not the wild kind that follows touchdowns or fireworks. It was quieter, warmer, the kind saved for something deeper. Lila stepped forward, medal in hand. She was nervous, but her eyes were steady. Ranger looked up at her, unmoving, but his tail thudded softly against the wood. "Hi, buddy," she whispered, kneeling. With careful fingers, she clipped the medal onto his vest. "You didn't just save Nate," she said softly, her voice caught in the microphone. "You saved this whole town." Ranger licked her hand once, then rested his head on her lap as she sat beside him on the stage floor. And no one told her to move. Behind the podium, the mayor tried to go on, but cleared his throat again, overcome. In the back row, 2 officers from the K-9 Division stood with quiet pride. Diane glanced their way, nodding in gratitude. She had declined an official role, but accepted a seat on the Community Safety Advisory Board. A voice, finally, where it had once been silenced. After the ceremony, people milled about the schoolyard. Teachers wiped tears discreetly. Parents asked to take pictures with Ranger. A little boy offered him a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich, which he accepted with careful politeness. Nate leaned against the fence beside Diane. "You think he knows?" he asked. Diane didn't answer immediately. She watched Ranger nudge a shy student forward to join a group of classmates. "I think he knows what matters," she finally said, "that his people are safe. That he didn't let the bad ones win. That's enough for him. Still no barking." Nate said with a soft grin. "Nope, he didn't bark for glory." Just then, a news reporter approached, holding out a microphone to Diane. "Can I ask," she said gently, "what message you hope this moment sends?" Diane looked towards the kids still playing near the stage, Ranger now trotting behind them like a quiet sentinel. She took a breath. "That sometimes the ones we discard are the ones who end up saving us." The reporter nodded, but the real answer came later, long after the ceremony, after the crowd dispersed and the sun dipped behind the pines. Lila sat on the porch, arms wrapped around Ranger's neck, the medal cool against her cheek. "I love you," she whispered. Ranger didn't move, but his ears twitched, and his eyes closed slowly. Then came the wind, soft stirring, And now, as the camera pulls back, and we see Snow Hollow bathed in twilight, a quiet voice echoes the final question, not just to Diane, or Nate, or Lila, but to you, wherever you are. What's your story with a loyal pet? If you've ever been saved by a silent glance, protected without command, or loved by something that never asked for thanks, then you already know the answer. And if you believe stories like Rangers deserve to be told, support the channel, honor the loyalty, subscribe for more true stories of courage, healing, and the dogs who never stop believing in us. Because not every hero wears a badge. Some just sit quietly and wait.